we start our first afternoon session, to chair this session, I would like to invite Dr. Nimrod Megiddo, who's a research staff member at Almaden, and he's a noted researcher in game theory, operations research, optimization, machine learning, and discrete mathematics, and theoretical computer science. He's won the Joseph Levy Prize, the ICS Prize, the Lanchester Prize, and 3 outstanding innovation awards from IBM. He's a prolific inventor with over 30 patents. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nimrod Megiddo.
Thank you, Dharmendra. I have great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Leslie Valiant of Harvard University. He's a chaired professor in computer science and applied mathematics. Leslie has made fundamental contributions to the theory of computer science, beginning with automata, complexity theory. In the early 80s, he actually laid the foundation to computational learning theory, and the whole series of prestigious conferences of computational learning theory started actually with his work. In the 1990s, he wrote a book about the circuits of the mind and other papers along the same lines. In my opinion, machine learning is the field that is the most properly positioned to solve the questions that we are interested in terms of actually computing, not just understanding how the brain functions. And we already know how to build programs that adapt themselves, optimize in a stochastic way, so it's not predictable what they would do. And we'll never know if they intend to do what they do, but they do what they do. Okay, please.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and also thanks very much for inviting me here. So this has been a really wonderful conference, at least up to now. So we have some technical problems here, but I think they're solvable. The contents of my talk is a theory of cortex, and in fact the last talk this morning was a perfect introduction. So I suppose the question I'm addressing is how all this ambitious stuff about associations and networks, hierarchies, could possibly be realized in cortex. So that's what I want to say, but I just want to start with a few remarks occasioned by a few things that will come up at the conference. So first of all, the term cognitive computing I really like. It's full of nice ambiguities about all the issues raised in the first lecture this morning. So I've used it myself. But I just want to point out that we are in trying to understand what cognitive computing is. We are at a kind of cusp. So even if you read the Turing 50 years ago on thinking, so he asked the question whether the best way of making programs to think in his terms was by programming them or by learning. And in fact, most of his paper deals with programming them. And he even made the rash statement that by the year 2000 he could achieve something, which he may have if he lived longer. So he doesn't discuss learning very much. But at this point, probably learning is kind of more successful as an approach compared to programming than people could have reasonably expected. And just I suppose a comment is that so there's this very vanilla way of looking at machine learning, where you just take a very general machine learning algorithm from a very small set, which are known to be quite good. You take lots of data and lots of data, and then you do very, very little else. So you put very little personal effort of your knowledge. So this is one way of getting some system to resemble cognitive tasks. Another way is to be more intelligent and try to actually program and use lots of knowledge. But at the moment, whatever you think of the achievements are in this kind of computing, in whether it's natural language processing, speech recognition, or computer vision, so you may like or dislike what can be done. But usually, whatever can be done as well by this very generic approach. So whereas people would have thought that a lot of expertise and careful programming is the way to go, in fact, having lots of data is the way to go. If you've got lots of data and a reasonably intelligent machine learning algorithm, you can do lots of things. And by machine learning, I mean generally data-intensive methods where you throw lots of data at the task. So in some sense, I think the tension here between the talks yesterday afternoon, which were kind of data-intensive, and in some sense produce spectacular results which are hard to get by other means, contrasts with other approaches. But most of us think that although I have a big stake in machine learning, that its present state of machine learning doesn't answer everything. So, okay, so I am interested in understanding cognition in the sense of many speakers here, and as far as things which many but not everyone in the room believes. So we believe that cognition will be better understood because there's an existence proof. Things like humans who exhibit cognition. So we think we'll do some kind of reverse engineering. We'll figure out how it's done, and maybe we can do something. But otherwise, I think many people in the room who try to work in this area, we believe that it's a well-defined scientific problem, and it kind of will be solved. But why is it difficult? Well, again, the one phrase I can put up is one which you heard by several speakers yesterday, is many levels. So many levels can mean various things, but it's different from just many scales. In the physical world, we discuss the problem of having many scales, but at least in the physical world, if you look at the stars through a telescope, you see a big scale, and you see what has to be explained. Somehow, in cognition, in the brain, it seems to be a bit more difficult. That the levels, it's harder to define the levels separately if you don't understand the interfaces. So in computer science, people talk about interfaces between different programs. Someone gives you a big program, you don't understand how the interface, you can't figure out, it's difficult to figure out what they're doing. So in some sense, the interfaces between the levels in cognition is difficult, and gives us a reasonable understanding why the problem is so difficult. Okay, so there are many levels. I don't want to discuss them all. There are some levels I'm interested in. So, so certainly as far as how knowledge gets into our heads, so evolution, we can't ignore that. Certainly low-level perceptual things we learn through evolution. That has to be dealt with. At the top end, I suppose that's rather similar to what the artificial intelligence level. So roughly we know what reasoning and learning everyday knowledge means, and that layer we don't understand too well, but I think there are approaches to that, and so one approach which I'm pursuing, in fact, does try to use machine learning to hit it on the head with. But my talk today is at this middle level, which is algorithms for networks of neurons, and there are many other levels which I haven't discussed. So this is what I do, so maybe the one slogan is that. So where I view this problem is that there are just. It's not that there are 1,000 solutions out there, and we're trying to figure out which one is right. But in the way I ask the questions, there seem to be kind of 0 solutions out there, and we're just wondering how it's possible at all. So the fact that the brain may be extremely resource bounded, that maybe we can just do what we can do. It's not that 50 million years ago, with our brains of our ancestors, we could do what we could do now, but we just didn't think of it. It's probably not like that. But somehow we just we somehow just got there. So if we have a theory, we may want a theory to address the question of in what way we can do more than a mouse. So it's a very resource constraint, and it does come. The approach is I'm a computer scientist. The approach comes entirely from there. So one wants to make the problem of cognition at this level into a standard task which computer scientists would think about. So what you need, you have to define a task. What do you want to achieve in a fairly precise way? So what is the model? What are the basic ground rules on which your basic components operate? And then what is the algorithm? What is the method which this model executes? And so in just in broad generality, so I'll repeat all this again, but I'm aiming for broad functionality. So if I can implement one thing well, it may not explain all of cognition. It may be some very small part. So I should worry about that. So I want broad functionality, some universality. At least I want to do several tasks. It's not just one task which we have to do. Memory isn't enough. Learning isn't enough. We need to do more. So the model, it'll emphasize quantitative constraints, and I'll get into there. I'll have numeric parameters. And by an algorithm, I want to be specific. I want to. Okay. So very roughly, this is what I do. It's even color-coded slightly. So I've got various tasks that I want to do. So one is memorization. There are various ways of formalizing that. Another one is association. The other basic ones are inductive learning, generalization. And the further things are dealing with relations, which in this sense means, this is in the AI sense, the point being that the world consists of more than one object. And when I have a notion like revenge, then there are usually two agents involved in that and some actions, etc. It's not a propositional world. So I'll say more about that. So as far as the model, the main thing about the model is that it'll have some numbers on. So the number of neurons, n, that's going to be important. So the number of connections which a neuron makes with other neurons, I'll call d. And then a third parameter which I'll find very important is synaptic strength. So very roughly what's going on is that the way the neurons are connected is sparse. Not everything is connected to everything else. So that causes difficulties. But the even greater difficulty is that if the synapses are weak, if a single neuron can only have a small influence on a neighbor, that's even worse. Then it's even more difficult to get any kind of coherent computation going. So these are basically the constraints which one has to fight against to write down an algorithm which does something. So I certainly want to be honest with, so switching times, people mentioned the 100-step rule. So my algorithms will run in 2 or 3 steps. So the algorithms are very simple, and there's no question that you can execute them in the time in which we do it. These are very basic tasks. And I'll come back to this again. So I don't need a very accurate model of what a neuron does, because the main constraint I'm fighting against is the difficulty of long-distance communication. And even if you gave me 2 supercomputers at every neuron, the things I try to do wouldn't be more easy to do, because they're so constrained by the difficulty of having an effect at a distance. Okay, so just a quick, it's hard to dismiss all previous work in one slide, but I'll try. So a way in which this differs from other previous work is, so first is how you define a task. So there's a notion of associative memory, which has been long studied. So that's basically, so computer scientists actually would call that a dictionary. So the functionality is that you can put an entry in, and then you can check whether it's already in there or not. But you can't do much else. So certainly one feature of the implementations is that it's very robust to certain kinds of noise, which is good. But otherwise, just being able to enter something into a book and seeing whether it's there, and that's kind of not all of cognition. So okay. So similarly, backpropagation. It's one algorithm for machine learning. That's fine. But again, it's a very isolated task. So independent of whether the algorithm is biologically realistic or even a good learning algorithm. So even if I grant you those. So the problem I have with that is that, again, it's very functionally very restricted. So you can train a box to recognize, say, elephants, but the brain isn't just one box to recognize elephants. So if you're going to train something on some target neurons, well, who chooses the target neurons? and then how do you use it to do the next step. So by more complete theory, one wants to do that. So I try to do several tasks at the same time in a compatible way. And the other difference between much previous work is that I don't think they've worried as much about being realistic on these numerical parameters. So the brain is short on the parameters. Okay, so all these resources, as we've seen, are expensive. Okay, so what? Let's get going. What's the theory? Well, there aren't too many assumptions. I suppose the only one I use is that if there's some real-world item, which maybe whatever it is, it could be an event, a person, today's breakfast, then there's some neurons which when you think of that item, they fire. Okay, so there's been much discussion about grandmother cells, yellow Volkswagens, whatever. But this is a very simple, concrete view of that story. Okay, so it's very simple. If you think of IBM, and there's some neurons in your brain which fire. Now, experimentally, there's some evidence that such neurons exist. So, for example, in hippocampus, there are place cells. You put a rat in a maze, and every time the rat goes in that corner, certain cells fire. Now, the fact that this is experimentally determinable, you can find cells in the hippocampus of a mouse which correspond to that corner of the maze, is kind of amazing. But what it means is that there must be an awful lot of these neurons. Okay, you just poke in randomly, and very quickly you can find these things, which is just amazing. So if a correspondence between what a neuron does and what and the neuron is easily verifiable by putting in electrodes, so it must be that the number of neurons which represent that item must be a lot. Okay. So of course this has been explored very widely, and maybe some celebrated results of Christoph Koch and co-authors. It's probably well known to many of you. So this one shows a neuron which fires rather energetically when it sees a picture of Bill Clinton, but not to other presidents and buildings and his father. Okay, and so this was done. This is on humans, epileptic patients. And again, the kind of surprise here is that, although I'm sure they worked very hard, that they were relatively easy to find. So there must be lots of neurons which respond to Bill Clinton. And in fact, if you look at their data, then a reasonable interpretation is that in the areas which they look at, kind of hippocampus, roughly, if you think of a concept like Bill Clinton or a rabbit, roughly 1 in 1,000 neurons will respond to that in a statistically significant manner. So that's amazing. So several million cells in hippocampus, and thousands of them apparently do Bill Clinton. Okay. So certainly with the animal experiments on mice and place cells, I think some experimentalists have the feeling that since these animals are overtrained and live in these boxes for months and do nothing else, that maybe there's so many neurons responding simply because their brain has been taken over by the task. But I don't think that's necessarily true. It may be just how things are represented. And so again, it may be that this person was overtrained on Bill Clinton. Who knows, but it's unlikely. Okay, so having said that, so if we take it as a fact that 1 in 1,000 neurons in the hippocampus responds to Bill Clinton, so then we have an option as far as the model. So does each cell do just one thing, or can a cell do many things? Now 1 in 1,000 is a pretty large fraction, so if you think that we know more than 1,000 concepts, which I think we do, then you have to be forced to the conclusion that cells do many things. Okay. So you can choose between whether you have a disjoint representation, each neuron does just one thing, or shared representation. And the trade-off is pretty clear, that if you allow shared representations, you can represent many more things. but then computation becomes more difficult. I mean, if a neuron does many things and you somehow update it, how do you keep track of everything? So there seems to be a clear trade-off. Okay. So let's just emphasize now a problem. So this is a problem of weak synapses. So how do you transmit influence at a distance if the connections in your brain are both sparse and weak? It's easy enough to say that you want to associate this with this, but if there aren't too many, how do you know that there are axons going from just those spaces, between those spaces, and if the influence of each one is weak on the target, you need some concrete explanations of how things happen. So here I've got a fourth parameter k. So roughly this is the how many presynaptic neurons you need to cause an action potential in a postsynaptic neuron. So there's no strong assumption about your model of neurons, whether linear or not. So if you've got a neuron, then it needs some number of other neurons to be active before it causes an action potential. And there is some such number. So what this number is when we compute cognitively isn't clear. So for a long time I looked at the case k equals 1. So if you've got very strong synapses, it really helps computation. It's much more Boolean. But typical estimates are that synapses are rather weaker. That of the to get up to threshold, you need maybe 5, maybe 300 of the inputs to be firing. So certainly the average synapse has to be weak, otherwise the brain would kind of blow up. The issue is rather whether there's a small number of strong synapses. Okay, so this problem has been articulated before. So given these constraints, it's what you can do is very limited. So for example, Abilis has discussed this a lot. So if you've got, supposing you need supposing you need firing of 3 inputs to cause a neuron to fire, then what can you do? Okay, so let's look at the top diagram. So supposing you've got 3 nodes firing on the left, how do you get any other node to fire? Well, you have to have connections to that node from all the 3. So you could imagine some train of signals traveling forward. So Abilis' version is generalizes that. So the width of this cable can be, of course, wider, but each one has to be connected to, say, 3 previous ones. Now, again, this is a reasonable thing to say, but you have to explain how you find these structures in the brain, and do they go from where you want them to, between where you want them, from where you want them to go to where you want them to go. So I described so far the constraint of the constraints the brain apparently presents. But now I want to discuss a bit about what kind of problems I'm interested in solving on the brain. So since my methodology is really to expose constraints, I want to solve the most difficult problems from the point of view of influence at a distance. And I call these random access tasks. So if your task is somehow just to cause a neighboring neuron to fire, then there are lots of solutions and there isn't much to say. But a random access task, a typical one is association. So supposing you've got 2 items already stored, so A could be Almaden and B could be blue skies, and I come here and I notice that the blue skies whenever I come to Almaden. So an association would be that I establish a circuit so that in the future when I think of Almaden, I'll think of blue skies. Okay, so I'm assuming that I've got this, say, R neurons which represent Almaden already, another R which represent blue skies. I want to change the circuit to set up this association. And the difficulty is that if I've already committed R neurons to A and R neurons to B, and who knows where they are, I mean, how do you set up these connections? Okay, and how do you set up this influence? So that's a random access task because I need to be able to link arbitrary parts of memory as one task. And so this long-distance communication becomes the central bottleneck. Okay, so the second basic task I want to look at, I'll just look at two, is memory formation. And now this is different from the usual associative memory. So what this is that now I've got two items already stored. So now maybe there's a restaurant in Boston which is called Almaden Blue Skies. And I know about Almaden, I know about Blue Skies, but I want to kind of establish storage for this restaurant so I can hang on more information about it. It's a good restaurant, whatever. So the task now is to set up a kind of like a hierarchy. So whenever in the future I think of A and B, I want the C neurons to fire as well. Okay, and again, the issue is how do you choose the C? Who chooses them? Where are they? Okay, so these are the basic tasks I want to implement, and it's not so easy given the constraints on the parameters. So there are other tasks I would be interested in too, but I won't discuss those too much. But I just want to emphasize that there is quite a bit going on here already. So memory formation is the one primitive I have for assigning new memory. And then the first time I think of something, I want to, that's where I localize some item. But after that, I can set up associations arbitrarily and build up a very complicated data structure. Okay, so I've got a basic way of locating where items are going to be stored, and then I can set up arbitrary complex data structures. Okay, okay, so again, here I just want to repeat the why I think this, why am I so reckless in trying to have a neural model here? So I think it's valid because on the one hand I choose ambitious tasks, these random access tasks which need arbitrary communication, and on the other, because what limits the implementation are really problems of long-distance influence. So networks are sparse, there are few connections, and the synapses on the average apparently are weak. Okay, so I can model these limitations by a few numerical parameters. And as I said, assumptions about what actually happens at the soma or in the dendritic tree aren't critical, because even if you gave me far more power, I can apparently do much more. I suppose the only slight assumption here is that because I do these random access tasks, so I'm required suddenly to link any information with any other information. So I have this very symmetric view of the world. So there's no great reason for a neuron to react asymmetrically to as many dendrites. I mean, for these tasks, for other tasks, there may be, but for these tasks, it just has to be ready to be able to set up new associations. Okay. Okay. So. So again, I'll tell you the content in a little while. So very roughly, what's come out of this is that if you assume very strong synapses, as k equals 1, then you can implement quite a rich set of tasks. And this I worked on a long time ago and wrote a book about it. But for a long time, I just couldn't see what you could do with weak synapses. And so more recent work, which is what I'm going to describe, is that with weak synapses, you can still do some stuff, which really surprised me. And so very roughly, the conclusion at the end will be that given the way I've defined the problem, there seem to be two regimes in which computation seems to be worthwhile. So in one, you've got very strong synapses. And okay, so why you have these combinations isn't clear yet in the talk. You have small r, so a concept represented by rather few neurons, maybe 50. Each item is represented by a distinct set of 50 neurons. Okay, so if you do this, then you can, computationally this is good. Representing items disjointly with disjoint neurons helps. So the main downside is that you've got it's very hard to verify this. If you've got 50 neurons to represent an orange, then you'll never find those. And also, there isn't much evidence. There's evidence for strong synapses, but the idea that very strong synapses are used for cognition, that's kind of the jury is out on that. So the other regime is much more what's observed. So there you've got weak synapses. So you need between 8 and 1,000, say, presynaptic neurons to fire to cause a postsynaptic neuron to fire. You have large R, so you have many neurons which represent an item, but a neuron can be shared by many items. And this is clearly experimentally easily verifiable. If you've got a million neurons doing something, you've got some chance of finding it. And so in this regime, I think is very similar to what I think people observe in the hippocampus with place cells or with these cells which recognize famous people. Okay. Okay. And again, so just the last slide pointing to what's coming. So the upshot of this theory, which I'll describe, is that so D is the number of connections you have, number of synapses each neuron has. So maybe okay, so maybe D 8,000, 16,000. These may be good numbers. How many the strength? This is the inverse of the synaptic strength. So maybe you like 30 presynaptic neurons to cause an action potential. You look down there, and then you'll find that I know you have 28,000 neurons which will represent one item, and this is 28,000 out of 10 million. So okay, so it's kind of like happen to be 1 in 1,000. Okay. So roughly these are, so we don't know what the actual numbers are. Different neural systems may work at different points in this graph, in this chart. But okay, so the main news here is that there are any numbers here at all. So what I'm claiming is that my tasks of memorization and association I can implement on realistic numbers of synapses and synaptic strengths. And you have many items, many neurons representing an item, roughly corresponding to what experiments suggest. Okay. Okay. So the question is, how on earth does one make these computations possible? Okay. So what the theory says is very simple. So I have, I assume, some sort of random graphs. So whether you have one region in the brain and look at it as a general random graph, or you've got a bipartite random graph, so you've got one layer, another layer, and connections between them, it all comes down to the same thing. So you may choose to view bipartite graphs as being some connection from one area to another area, or you may look at connections within a single area. So what's the theory? So the main thing about the theory is that it is the simplest imaginable. Okay, the simplest imaginable. So it's kind of a repetition almost of the definition. So this is memory formation. So the notion of Almaden I've already assigned R neurons to in my brain. And the notion of blue skies I've already assigned R neurons to in my brain. And what I want to do is to assign a number of neurons to this restaurant called Almaden Blue Skies. That's what I want to do. So what should I do? Well, the definitions almost tell me that what I have to do. Because if this neuron is to somehow represent anything to do with those inputs, it will have to be richly connected to those inputs. So in particular, if I need K presynaptic neurons to cause this to fire, I'll need K connections to these inputs. Okay, so that's kind of all I'm saying. Okay, so this is a random graph. So maybe you can guess. So the question is, where on earth in my brain am I going to assign storage to this restaurant? Okay, well, I mean the only possible place. So I'll assign storage to this restaurant at exactly those nodes, which are richly enough connected to the things to which I want to semantically connect them to. So there's some variance on this. So I could have it connected k-wise to A and k-wise to B, and kind of, and that's it. Okay, so,
It's
oops.
k-wise to A
Well, okay, so you can, I'll say it in a second. You can do ky to a, okay, so depending on what the algorithm is. So one algorithm says I'm going to fire these, wake up these nodes, then I'm going to fire these and wake up these nodes. In that case, I'll need k from both a and to b. Another algorithm says fire them all at the same time, then I'll need k from between a and b together. Okay, so these are variations you can do, and they're very similar. But before we get to that, I'm just sort of spelling out a few more words. So the conditions you have to realize are kind of not totally trivial. So the intention you have to realize, so the expected number of nodes where you're going to store your restaurant has to be R. But you also want various non-interference conditions. So for example, if you have to decide, so when do you represent Almaden? If all the nodes are firing, that's Almaden. What if a half are firing? What if a third? Okay, so in general, the kind of assumption I make is that if, say, less than a half are firing, it's not Almaden. If more than 90%, it is Almaden. And in between, it shouldn't happen. That won't happen. Okay, so you want various other conditions that if these are firing and only half of these are firing, you don't want to be reminded of the restaurant. Okay, so you got a list of non-interference conditions, which I won't detail. But the analysis you have to do for this is straightforward. So this beta stands for Bernoulli. So this just is the tail of the binomial distribution. So if you toss a coin R times, and the coin comes up with probably p heads, then you want there to be at least k heads. And this number tells you that. Okay, so just the estimates of the tail of the binomial distribution. So depending on the two cases I just asked about, so what I want to do is I want this restaurant to be an equal citizen with my previous concepts. So I want the number of neurons to represent this to be the same as, I want this to be R. So, so the way I've shown it, so this is the equation I want. So this beta, so this is the fraction of neuron, probability that the single neuron, so if I choose a random neuron, what's the probability it will have at least k connections to this fixed set of R? So it's going to be this. So if it's going to be connected to both A and B, I square it. And I want this fraction to be not too big and not too small. I want it to be just right. So the number of candidate neurons for my restaurant will be R. So the fraction will be R over N. Okay, so so in computer science terms, there's just so how do I choose it's a hashing process. So to choose the neurons you represent your restaurant at is a hash function where the function is determined by the random connections you have in your brain at that time. Okay, and that's another variant. Okay, so it's the kind of the zero. Okay, so if you want to, so I haven't described the algorithms yet, but the hard part is actually getting the graph to have the right connectivity. So vicinal, so means neighborly. So the point about these algorithms are that they rely on just very neighborly interactions. They're the naivest thing you can expect. There's no addressing, there's no long cables which go in many steps. Everything you explain in terms of just neighborly connections. And why it works is because you store things at just the right place where you want them. So this is storage. So as I said, this is one of the primitives. The other primitive is that once you've stored an item, you can set up an association between this item and some other item. Okay, so that's a different task. So one implementation works through an intermediate layer, and again, you want an effect, which is that if you cause these things to fire, so this is Almaden, and now I want to think of blue skies, and I want to set up a network so that in the future, whenever I think of this, these will fire. There's some constraints again that through some other nodes, there are k connections between the neurons to the other level. It's very similar. Okay, but this can be done also, and it's got some boundary conditions and some equations, and okay. So you have various equations, and solving the equations gives you those numerical values the tables which I gave you. Okay. Now, so the other part which I have to comment on is that I haven't described the algorithms for you. So I said the hard part is overcoming the sparseness of the graph and the weakness of the interactions. But I also promised you that I'll tell you how the algorithms work. So I have written down a model which is called the neuronal model. So it models the communication by these parameters. The model of the actual soma is weak because I don't really care what it does. What I require of it is very weak. And the point of the model is that it's like a programming language. It encourages you to write programs in the style and to make them precise. Now, computational models are, I think, a bit like equations in physics, and maybe they're not that appreciated outside the community. So, in some sense, equations in physics per se are kind of boring. So, if you look at Maxwell's equations, they're kind of boring. Okay, but what's good about the equations is that if you solve them, you get some amazing solutions. So, you can predict the speed of light, you can predict radio waves. So, that's amazing, and people have predicted many things since. So, of course, the most famous model of computation is a Turing machine, and again, it's very cool. So Turing show that the universal Turing machines. They show that there's things which are not computable. And then amazing other things have been done since, which is all very cool. So, in some sense, the point of a model of computation is the same as that of an equation. That its main value is that if it can actually predict some totally surprising things. If it just gives back to you what you put in, it's not that interesting. So with models, so there are many models of computation which are used to model different phenomena, and their value depends on you can't tell by looking at them. You have to tell what they predict. So I don't want to have to say too much about these, but so maybe just the last line. Okay. So what's a model of computation which models neurons? So many people have said a Turing machine isn't the right one. So roughly what goes on here is that I've got this individual model neurons, and so I and J are their names, their numbers, and so SI is the state of model of neuron I, and so WJ is the weight, is the strength of the synapse from, WIJ. So WIJ is the strength of the synapse from I to J, and WI is the sum of the weights of the synapses from firing neurons going into WJ. Is it I or J? I. Okay. So I've got various update rules. So I'm saying that the state. So that's not okay. So I've got states and weights, and they're all updated locally depending on what you'd expect. Okay. So the only aspect of the model which may be worth commenting on is timing. So very roughly, you've got this small. Each neuron has a little program riding on it. So you're a neuron, your program, you've got no inputs, nothing is happening, but you're in a state. So your program would say things like, if more than 5 of my inputs are firing, I wake up, I go into state 2, and okay. And if I'm in state 2, given certain inputs, I maybe go into another state, and maybe I change my synapse weights. So each neuron has a very little local program written on it. And there's some global mechanism to wake them all up. So you can imagine some sort of attentional mechanism. Suddenly you're given an image, and somehow all your neurons are woken up. And these neurons have a very weak sense of timing. They can count up to 1, 2, 3. So if I go into the next state, and the other neurons go into the next state, then somehow we all know that after that, the inputs I'm expecting, I know are from neurons which have got to their second stage. So it's a very weak sense of global synchronization. There's no global clock. There's a global way of waking things up, a global way of supplying information, But after that, each neuron counts 1, 2, 3, roughly in sync. And then these algorithms die away very fast. Okay. So that's the model. And on this model, I can okay, so for memory formation, I may want to make some changes to the weights to reserve these nodes for an item. And if I do that, the program executes it, as you'd expect. Okay. So again, the upshot is that given these constraints of realistic synaptic weights and numbers of synapses, one can overcome these constraints to realize the tasks of association in the way I've described it and this memorization. Okay, so the news is that one can fill up this table. Okay, so these numbers aren't totally arbitrary. So people always say, well, what can you predict? So this is a rule of thumb which tries to summarize that. So very roughly, I've got 4 parameters, and the prediction is that they're related. So this means about the same as, but slightly bigger than. So this says that the number of neurons you need to cause an action potential in the postsynaptic neuron R is the number of neurons to represent an item, D is the number of connections to other neurons, N is the number of neurons in the system. And for these algorithms to work, and for a broad variety of similar ones, they all require the same of this random graph. And there isn't any great mystery there, because what happens, the phenomena they're all exploiting is that, so when I selected neurons to represent my restaurant, I wanted some neurons to represent the restaurant, not too many, not too few. And what it boiled down to is that I had all my neurons as candidates for being a representative of my restaurant. And okay, so each neuron does become a candidate if it's richly connected to my A and B. And I want there to be rather few neurons which are so richly connected, but still some. So K will be slightly above the expectation. Okay, so all these phenomena rely on the fact that you're going to select things on the tails of binomial distributions. Okay, I want some neurons to serve as representatives of my restaurant, but not too many. And the ones I'll choose will be simply ones which statistically, by chance, happen to be those. And statistically, there will be a certain number of them controlled by the tail of the binomial distribution. So, okay, so one prediction is that if you look at neural systems which do this kind of stuff, this relationship should hold. So in one direction, this relationship is kind of doesn't say too much. So if K were much weaker than this, then all the neurons would somehow fire and things would blow up. But the content is that with synaptic strength in this range, you can do kind of a lot of computation. And okay, so for example, for the human hippocampus, so it's hard to get measurements of all 4 numbers for neural systems. So I suppose synaptic strengths, we don't quite know what happens in human hippocampus. So the one system in which all these parameters have been measured is the locust olfactory system, and this is recent work of Gilles Laurent and co-workers at Caltech. And so this is the lowest level of the olfactory system. So it consists of some projection neurons, and the next layer are the Kenyan cells. And so this group has really analyzed the system in great detail. So I've still got my 4 parameters, N, D, K, and R, except now, in fact, the 2 layers, I need different numbers because different letters because they're different. So the high-level ones are represented by capital letters. And well, okay, so a brief description is that the 830 cells are the first layer, and then 50,000 in the second layer. so when a random smell is presented, then maybe half of these cells fire, but only a very small fraction of the cells one layer above. So what this system seems to do is seems to be a sparsifier. It converts a dense representation to a sparse one. So why it should do that, one can speculate, but certainly if you have a sparse representation, then you can compute more easily on it. If you have a dense representation, you can represent more smell, so it makes sense. But whatever the purpose is, what I'm worried about is whether the numbers fit. And they do. So we don't have to go through all the numbers, but so the final thing is that So again, so what the theory would say here is that so this task is different from either association or memorization, but it's a kind of an intermediate thing. So what would a node represent at the high level? Well, what you'd expect is that a node here represents maybe a natural smell. So again, according to this philosophy, so if half of the neurons represent a natural smell, which of these neurons do you want to represent that smell? Well, it'll be just those which happen to be richly connected to that half. And so in the end, the kind of numbers work out within the experimental errors. So I think measuring these numbers is important. So neuroscience doesn't tend to be very numerical. So if I ask neuroscientists questions about, what's the value of this number or that number, they're not too interested. But I think the system is very constrained by numbers, and it's not obvious how to find any solutions to these problems given the numbers that exist. So many problems come up which I don't want to go into. So maybe the most important one, which I haven't given a good answer to yet, is capacity. So you can ask, well, how many memories can the system do? And the answer is lots and lots, but I don't quite have a clean answer to that, because since I want to implement several functions and I want to resist various interference conditions, it's harder and harder to actually give a clean answer. But I'm sure that this system does, with reasonable numbers, you can represent probably hundreds of thousands of concepts. But that needs more work. So what's the conclusion? So it does give an approach to understanding systems of neurons. It's very much geared towards these numerical values and try to overcome the weakness which they imply. And and I said two styles of cortical computations. Again, I'll just bring this up again. That so it may be that in some areas of cortex where people haven't been able to identify what neurons do, so where they're silent cells, maybe in prefrontal cortex, you need strong synapses to do more complex computations, but it's hard to find out what they're doing. Whereas near the sensory areas, there are good reasons for representing large numbers of concepts, have shared representations, and this shared overlapping representations, which experiments suggest, may be the way to go. Okay, so I'll stop there. Okay.
Wonderful talk, Les. Robert Heck Nielsen. The concern I have is that in cognition, the dependence of the outcome of some computation, if you will, or some cognitive operation, isn't always on two inputs. And so one possible criticism of your neuroidal memory cell, if you will, or module, is that to have, for example, dependence upon 5 inputs, which has to be implemented instantly in cognition, like, for example, in the system that I showed yesterday, where you're actually producing sentences. Many of those computations involve a multitude of inputs. if you were to draw a diagram using your cell of how you would do a 5-input, 1-output computation, that would involve a number of cells. And finally, you yourself mentioned the fact in passing that there must be some sort of timing mechanism. But in fact, if you're going to have a timing mechanism, why not just do confabulation, which requires a deliberate timing signal, which we know actually exists. I mean, this is what Wolf Singer is seeing and others are seeing in the data. So in some sense, I don't see the relative advantages of this. Maybe you could comment on that.
Well, I think so the main question I'm addressing is how with realistic values of these parameters you can implement something. So this is the only approach I know which does this. So you're right that if I go outside my assumptions, I have to work harder. Maybe I have to introduce some timing to do it. But I use a weak sense of timing. But I think one has to get started somehow. So so I think some set of primitives which has some generality implemented with these values of the parameters is what I'm aiming for.
But in the case of olfaction, this is very compelling. In fact, it's a beautiful explanation.
Okay.
Over here. So, Leslie? Here. Straight ahead. That is a puzzling voice. So, it's of course simple is very nice, and it's nice that one. It's very nice that one can have a simple way to describe things, but the issue is whether it's at all relevant. And this sounds like the last of the theoreticians holding on to the static synapse. It's absolutely clear that you have this extreme dynamics, which means the number of neurons that are going to be fired by any one type of cell is dynamically changing depending on context, depending on the frequency, coincidences, a whole host of other different types of things in any region, and not only in mammals, but going down to insects. In fact, that's how an insect can control multiple muscles, is by using dynamic synapses. And so, the bottom line is that's a nice analysis, but what at all is the relevance to how the brain is doing anything?
Well, the connectivity of the brain doesn't change that much. The brain doesn't rewire itself in microseconds. But the amount of rewiring, I suspect.
But we're talking about the millisecond timing. Yeah. The synaptic strength can change from one spike to the next spike by a factor of 10. You've seen all those things, and it's not just our work, but dozens of people's work. Ted Berger's work in the hippocampus. Olfactory bulb has a whole spectrum of different types of synapses, even though it's such a slow-coding region. It's just no relevance. This kind of synapses is just absolutely unavoidable. So why don't you develop a way to analyze how they work?
Okay, so the challenge for you is to make a model which works on...
This is biology. I don't need to be challenged. That's what the biology says. The challenge for you as a theoretician to actually deal with the biology, and this is not biology.
No. But if you're a biologist, you're trying to understand what's going on. You have to have something in your mind. You're not just counting stuff, right? You have some idea in your mind what's going on. So you have to quantify how much you think the network is changing. You have to supply some data rather than criticize other people's numbers. You have to give me some parameters.
At least I commend you for sticking to the approach.
Okay. I think Henry Markram has just about covered the question I was going to ask, but I'll put it in my own phrasing. I think it's a big mistake to say you're not interested in the timing of what neurons do, because aside from associating static patterns, largely what brains also have to do is deal with patterns that are changing and with associations across time, and certainly with us humans recognizing speech, where the change across time is the key element to be recognized. So let me just ask you two very specific questions that I think also illustrate aspects that you've chosen to leave out, I guess, to simplify the problem, but I think they're pretty important. One is, what in your system determines what things are to be associated with what other things? You've sort of put that down as a given from above, but in the brain, something has to determine what's to be associated. And then secondly, you've indicated that you're satisfied if 50%, if less than 50% of the cells fire, it's not a recognition of that pattern. And I'm just asking who or what counts up, since these cells are randomly distributed according to the random graph, it would seem you need a mechanism to count up how many of them have actually responded in a given situation.
Well, so on your zeroth point, so as far as timing, I am very interested in timing. So in some sense, problems which are hard to solve, timing mechanisms is a way of solving, is a programming method of solving almost all problems. But there's so many solutions to that if I can avoid timing, it offers a lot of simplicity. There's just nothing which tells me which way to use timing, but it's clearly important. So on your last point, so the point is that no one counts up the neurons, but the algorithms have to work correctly and under certain conditions. So I'm saying that if when the initial neuron sets, you fire them all or over 90%, then these chains of associations will happen, and all the ones you want to fire will fire more than 90%. The ones you don't fire will fire less than 50%. Okay, so this will work without anyone counting up. And so then your first question was...
How is it decided what pairs of things are to be associated?
Okay, so that I didn't describe. So a long time ago I wrote a book where I tried to put this kind of thing in context. So I do use some notion of working memory, of which the details I don't take strong positions on. But you do need some attention mechanism and working memory too. So this is kind of how you feed that kind of system. Okay.
I have a question, but before that, if you don't mind, I want to answer Henry.
Okay, feel free.
What you said, you're actually using, my understanding is you're using probability theory to find, and you estimate these numbers. So even if after every hours or whatever it is, the wiring is totally different, as long as there are neurons which are on and they are the representation, it doesn't matter that they changed every time to another R, as long as there are some R, which is the memory representation of A and B. So even if the synapses have changed, the probability still stays, as long as you have some whatever steps in which whenever you look, there are about R neurons on. So this is just an answer for that. I don't know if...
Neurons may be required to fire the cell. All the calculations are just nonsense.
Well, okay, so that's answered.
I understand your point, but I also understand the modeling. There is some... Okay, let me ask the question.
Okay,
I'll leave that for you. Okay.
Okay, so to answer your question, that this is an extremely robust way in which, given a network, so you can change the network if you grow new neurons, new connections. This is very robust against that. So the only way in which this is irrelevant is if what you're claiming is that if I want to do a cognitive act, I rewire my brain to serve that cognitive act.
Look, it's very simple. That is not a synapse. Okay, you're not using synapses. That's why it's not relevant. That is not a synapse.
My question. You derive this equation of k greater or equal than R, and this comes from the Bernoulli that you had before.
right.
Now, for this, you really assumed that the same number of neurons have to be in the input and in the output layer. Now, if you're looking, for example, in the low-cost, you saw that there is a big difference in the total N between 830 and 50,000. And this actually happens in a couple of other areas. So if you were to take different R, I think it can be very interesting to derive some other relations.
Right, yeah, right. You're right. So there's no reason to believe that each layer
Has the same size.
uses the same R, and you can easily adapt this to different Rs. But the conclusions aren't that different if the Rs are kind of moderate values. And I just wanted to make the point of this equal citizenship, that if you assign storage for a new item, you want it to be a real equal citizen with the previous ones. You can do
I think we need
combinations
to
of that.
move on at this point. So thank you very much again.